The blizzard came down from the mountains without warning, turning the Arizona high country into a white tomb where Katelyn Blake stumbled through drifts that reached her knees. Her fingers numb inside worn gloves, and her breath coming in ragged gasps that frosted the scarf wrapped around her face. She had left Fort McDowell 3 days ago with a wagon train heading to California, but when her father collapsed from fever and died within hours, the wagon master had given her exactly one choice: bury him fast and keep up, or stay behind. She had chosen to stay, digging his grave in the frozen ground with her own bleeding hands, and by the time she finished, the wagons were gone, taking with them every person she knew and every possession she owned, except what she carried on her back. The snow had started that same evening, first as innocent flurries that melted on her coat, then as thick curtains that erased the trail completely. She had been walking for 2 days, rationing the small amount of bread and dried meat in her pack, sleeping in whatever shelter she could find among the rocks and pines. Now the food was gone, her water flask was frozen solid, and she could no longer feel her feet inside her boots. The landscape looked the same in every direction, just endless white interrupted by dark shapes that might be trees or boulders or her own imagination playing tricks. She knew she was going to die out here, 20 years old with her whole life unlived, and the unfairness of it made her want to scream, but she did not have the energy even for that. She fell for the 10th time that hour, her legs simply refusing to hold her weight anymore, and this time she did not get up right away. The snow felt almost soft beneath her, almost welcoming, and she thought maybe she would just rest here for a minute, just close her eyes and gather her strength. Her mother used to sing a lullaby about angels watching over lost children, and Katelyn found herself humming it now, her voice cracking on the melody. She wondered if her father was somewhere warm now, somewhere beyond pain and fever, and if he would be waiting for her when she crossed over. The sound of hoofbeats cut through the wind like a miracle. Katelyn forced her eyes open, squinting against the snow, and saw a rider emerging from the white curtain, a dark silhouette on a dark horse. She tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper, swallowed by the storm. She lifted one arm instead, waving it weakly, praying he would see her before he passed by. The rider turned his horse toward her, and as he came closer, she could make out more details. A tall man in a long coat with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the weather, a red scarf covering the lower half of his face, leather chaps crusted with ice and snow. He dismounted in one smooth motion and was kneeling beside her a moment later, his hands on her shoulders, his voice urgent through the scarf. "Can you hear me? Madam, can you hear me?" "Yes," Katelyn whispered. "I can hear you, thank God. What are you doing out here alone? Where's your horse?" "No horse. I was with a wagon train. They left me." She saw his eyes widen, bright blue eyes that held a mixture of shock and anger. "They left you in this storm. What kind of yellow-bellied cowards would do that? My father died. They would not wait." The cowboy said something under his breath that was definitely a curse, then lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. "We need to get you warm. There's a line shack about a mile from here. Can you hold on to me if I put you on the horse?" "I think so." He carried her to the horse, a sturdy bay gelding with kind eyes, and lifted her into the saddle. Then he swung up behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist to hold her steady and gathering the reins with his other hand. His body was solid and warm against her back, blocking the worst of the wind. "My name is Henry Whitman," he said close to her ear. "I have got you now. You are safe." Katelyn leaned back against him, letting him take her weight, and for the first time in days, she felt something like hope stirring in her chest. She did not know this man, did not know if she could trust him, but he had stopped when he could have ridden past, had lifted her with gentle hands, and his voice held genuine concern. That had to count for something. Henry guided the horse through the storm with the confidence of someone who knew this land well, and true to his word, within a mile a small cabin materialized from the snow, squat and solid with smoke coming from its chimney. "Someone is here already," he said, and there was relief in his voice. "That's good. We will have help getting you warmed up." He dismounted and helped her down, then half-carried her to the door and pushed it open without knocking. Inside, a fire crackled in a stone hearth, and a man with gray hair and a weathered face looked up from where he sat mending a bridle. "Henry, what in blazes are you doing out in this weather? And who is that?" Found her about a mile north, half frozen. Her wagon train abandoned her. The older man was on his feet immediately, pulling a chair closer to the fire. "Set her here. I will get blankets and hot coffee." "Poor girl looks about done in." Henry lowered Katelyn into the chair and knelt to pull off her boots, his movements efficient but careful. Her feet were white and waxy looking, and she saw his jaw tighten. "These are frostbitten. We need to warm them slowly or she could lose toes." The gray-haired man returned with an armful of wool blankets and a tin cup of steaming coffee. "I am Thomas Reid," he said to Katelyn. "I work for the same outfit as Henry here. You are safe now, miss. We will take good care of you." Katelyn wrapped her hands around the cup, feeling the heat seep through her numb fingers. "Katelyn Blake, thank you for helping me. I do not know what would have happened if Henry had not found me." "You would have died," Henry said bluntly, wrapping one of the blankets around her shoulders. "Another hour in that cold and you would have frozen solid." Thomas shot him a look. "Maybe save the grim talk for later, boy. The girl has been through enough." Henry had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Sorry, I just cannot believe anyone would leave a woman alone in the wilderness like that." "What was the name of this wagon train?" "The Morrison Company, heading to Sacramento, but please do not blame them too harshly. My father had cholera, or they thought he did. They were frightened of contagion." "Did he?" Thomas asked gently. "No, it was pneumonia, I think. He had been coughing for weeks, and then the cold made it worse. He died very quickly at the end." Henry was still working on her feet, rubbing them gently with a cloth dipped in lukewarm water. His touch was surprisingly tender for such large hands, and Katelyn found herself studying him properly for the first time now that he had removed his hat and scarf. He looked to be in his mid-20s, with thick dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. His blue eyes were striking, framed by dark lashes, and there was something about the set of his shoulders that suggested both strength and reliability. He was handsome in a rough, unpolished way, like a wild horse that had not quite been broken. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and their eyes met. Katelyn felt something shift in her chest, a strange flutter that had nothing to do with the cold. Henry held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw something flicker in his expression before he looked away, focusing once more on her feet. "Feeling is starting to come back," he said. "That is a good sign." It was a good sign, though it hurt terribly. Katelyn bit her lip to keep from crying out as pins and needles shot through her toes and up her legs. Henry must have seen her distress because he said quietly, "I know it hurts. That means the blood is flowing again. Try to breathe through it." She did, taking slow, deep breaths the way her mother had taught her to do when she was in pain, and gradually the worst of it subsided to a dull ache. Thomas brought her more coffee and a plate of beans and cornbread, which she ate ravenously despite the fact that her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the spoon. The two men talked quietly while she ate, discussing cattle and snow, and whether the storm would let up by morning. Their conversation was comfortable, easy, the talk of men who had worked together for a long time and trusted each other. When she finished eating, exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. Henry noticed immediately and stood, offering his hand. "You need sleep. Take my bedroll in the corner there. Thomas and I will keep the fire going and make sure you stay warm." "I cannot take your bed," Katelyn protested weakly. "Yes, you can. I have slept in worse places than a chair by the fire." She was too tired to argue. She let him lead her to the corner where a thick bedroll was spread on the floor, and she collapsed onto it fully clothed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. She was asleep within seconds, falling into darkness so complete that she did not even dream. When she woke, gray daylight was filtering through the cabin's single window and the storm had stopped. She sat up slowly, her body aching in about 100 places, and saw Henry asleep in the chair by the fire, his head tipped back and his arms crossed over his chest. Thomas was nowhere to be seen, though she could hear the sound of an axe splitting wood somewhere outside. She watched Henry for a moment, taking in the lines of exhaustion on his face, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. He had stayed up all night to keep watch over her, she realized. To make sure she stayed warm and safe. Something warm bloomed in her chest, a feeling she could not quite name. She stood carefully, testing her feet. They were sore and tender, but she could walk on them, which seemed like a miracle. She added wood to the fire as quietly as she could, then went to the window and looked out at a world transformed. Snow covered everything in a pristine white blanket that glittered in the weak sunlight, and the sky was a pale, washed-out blue. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. "Quite a storm," Henry said behind her, and she turned to find him awake and watching her. "How are you feeling?" "Sore, but alive thanks to you." He stood and stretched, wincing at the creak of his joints. "Just did what anyone would do. No, most people would have ridden past. You stopped, and you saved my life." Henry looked uncomfortable with her gratitude, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Well, could not just leave you there." Thomas came in then, stamping snow from his boots, carrying an armload of firewood. "Good, you are both awake." "I shot a rabbit this morning. Thought we could have a proper breakfast before we figure out what to do next." What to do next? Katelyn had been trying not to think about that. She had no money, no supplies, no horse, and no idea where to go. Her father had sold everything they owned to pay for passage on the wagon train, and she had no family left in the East. The plan had been to reach California and start fresh, but that plan had died along with her father on the trail outside Fort McDowell. Henry must have read the despair on her face because he said quickly, "We will figure something out. First, let us eat." The rabbit was good, roasted over the fire and seasoned with salt and wild herbs that Thomas had collected. While they ate, Henry asked her questions about her journey, where she had come from, what she had planned to do in California. Katelyn found herself telling him everything. How her mother had died of influenza 3 years ago back in Missouri. How her father had never quite recovered from the grief. How he had decided that a fresh start in California was the only thing that would save them both. She told him about the long journey west, the dust and heat and endless walking, the other families on the wagon train who had been kind at first but had grown cold when her father took sick. She told him about digging the grave with her own hands because no one would help her, about watching the wagons pull away and realizing she was completely alone. "You are not alone anymore," Henry said when she finished, and the conviction in his voice made her believe him. "When this snow melts enough to travel, I will take you back to Fort McDowell. There are good people there who will help you. I have no money to pay them with." "We will figure it out," he said again. "You are a hard worker, right? Can you cook, so keep house?" "Yes, all of those things." Then you will find work. Fort McDowell is growing. There are always people who need help. Thomas nodded agreement. Henry is right. And until you get settled, you can stay with the Carmichaels. They run the boarding house and they are good Christian folk who would not turn away someone in need. It was not much of a plan, but it was more than Katelyn had, and she felt the tight knot of fear in her chest loosen slightly. These men were helping her without asking for anything in return, treating her with respect and kindness that she had not expected. It made her want to trust them, and trust was something she had thought she had lost entirely. They stayed at the line shack for 2 more days, waiting for the snow to melt enough to make travel safe. Henry and Thomas were easy companions, filling the hours with stories about their work as ranch hands for the double-bar spread, about cattle drives and difficult horses, and the time Thomas had accidentally roped a bear instead of a calf. They made her laugh despite everything she had been through, and she found herself relaxing in their presence, letting down the walls she had built to survive. Henry, in particular, seemed to go out of his way to make her comfortable. He gave her his coat when she went outside to help gather firewood, insisted she eat the largest portions at meals, and treated her with a careful courtesy that was oddly touching. She caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, his blue eyes thoughtful and intent, and each time their gazes met she felt that strange flutter in her chest again, stronger now, harder to ignore. On the 3rd morning, Henry declared the trail passable. They packed up the cabin, banking the fire and leaving it as they had found it, and then Henry lifted Katelyn onto his horse once more. She rode in front of him, his arm secure around her waist, and Thomas followed on his own mount. The journey to Fort McDowell took most of the day, the horses picking their way carefully through the melting snow and mud. The temperature had risen dramatically, and water dripped from every tree and rock, the world coming alive again after its frozen sleep. Fort McDowell appeared in the late afternoon, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden structures clustered around a military fort. It was bigger than Katelyn had expected, with a main street lined with shops and saloons, a church with a white steeple, and houses spreading out in every direction. People moved through the streets despite the mud, going about their business, and the sound of a hammer ringing on an anvil suggested there was a blacksmith nearby. Henry guided the horse to a large 2-story building with a sign that read Carmichael Boarding House, and helped Katelyn dismount. "Wait here," he said. "I will go talk to Mrs. Carmichael." He disappeared inside and Katelyn stood in the muddy street, suddenly nervous. What if Mrs. Carmichael refused to take her in? What if no one in this town wanted to help a stranger with no money and no prospects? She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling small and lost. Thomas must have noticed her distress because he said kindly, "Do not worry, girl. Henry will make it right. He is good at that." "Why is he helping me so much?" Katelyn asked. "He does not know me." Thomas smiled. "That is just who Henry is. He cannot stand to see someone suffering without trying to fix it. Drives him crazy when things are not fair or right, and what happened to you was not right." Before Katelyn could respond, Henry emerged from the boarding house followed by a stout woman with gray-streaked brown hair and a warm, open face. "You poor dear," the woman said, coming straight to Katelyn and taking her hands. "Henry told me what happened. You come inside right now and we will get you fed and settled. I am Dorothy Carmichael, and you are welcome to stay here as long as you need." Relief washed over Katelyn so strongly that her knees almost buckled. "Thank you. I will work to pay for my room. I can clean and cook and whatever else you need." "We will work something out," Dorothy said, patting her hands. "Come on now, let us get you inside." Henry caught Katelyn's eye as Dorothy led her toward the door, and he smiled at her, a real smile that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. "See," he said. "Told you we would figure it out." Katelyn smiled back, feeling something warm and bright unfurling in her chest. "Thank you, Henry, for everything." "You are welcome, Katelyn." The way he said her name, soft and careful, made that flutter return to her chest. She held his gaze for another moment, then let Dorothy pull her inside. The boarding house was clean and comfortable, with worn but sturdy furniture and the smell of fresh bread in the air. Dorothy showed her to a small room on the second floor that held a bed, a washstand, and a wardrobe. "It is not much," Dorothy said, "but it is warm and dry and the bed is comfortable. You rest today and tomorrow we will talk about what work you can do to earn your keep." Katelyn sat on the bed, running her hand over the patchwork quilt. "This is perfect, more than I expected." "Henry said you lost your father recently." "I am so sorry, dear. That must have been terribly hard." "It was, but I am trying to be strong like he would have wanted." Dorothy patted her shoulder. "You are strong. Anyone can see that. Not many girls could survive what you have been through. Now, I will bring you up some hot water so you can wash, and then there will be supper in about an hour. Come down whenever you are ready." After Dorothy left, Katelyn lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. 4 days ago, she had been digging her father's grave, certain she was going to die alone in the wilderness. Now she was in a warm room in a friendly town, with work and a place to stay, all because a cowboy with blue eyes had been riding through a blizzard at exactly the right moment. It felt like fate, or divine intervention, or just impossibly good luck. She thought about Henry, about the way he had held her so carefully on his horse, the way he had rubbed life back into her frozen feet, the way he had said her name. She barely knew him, but she felt drawn to him in a way that was both exciting and terrifying. She had never felt this way about anyone before. Back in Missouri, there had been boys who had courted her, farmers' sons who had been kind and respectful and utterly boring. Henry was different. There was an intensity to him, a sense that he felt things deeply and cared about things that mattered. She wanted to know more about him, wanted to understand what made him stop to help a stranger in a storm. She wanted to see him again. That night at supper, which was served at a long table in the boarding house's dining room, Katelyn met some of the other boarders. A schoolteacher named Miss Sarah Connolly, a clerk from the general store named Albert Hughes, and a prospector named Bill Tanner, who regaled everyone with unlikely stories about gold strikes and close calls with rattlesnakes. They were all friendly and welcoming, asking her questions about her journey but not prying when she kept her answers brief. Dorothy served a delicious meal of beef stew and fresh bread, and afterward, Sarah invited Katelyn to sit on the porch with her. "It is nice to have another young woman around," Sarah said as they settled into rocking chairs. "I am the only female boarder most of the time, and the men can be a bit overwhelming with their talk of mining and cattle." Katelyn smiled. "How long have you been in Fort McDowell?" 2 years. "I came from Philadelphia to teach at the school. My family thought I was crazy to move out west, but I love it here. The territory is beautiful and the people are genuine. What are your plans, if you do not mind me asking?" "I am not sure yet. I need to find work, save some money. Beyond that, I suppose I will see what opportunities arise." "Well, if you need anything or just want someone to talk to, I am in the room right next to yours. Us women need to stick together out here." It was comforting to have an ally, and Katelyn thanked her warmly. They talked for another hour as the sun set and the temperature dropped, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Katelyn found herself relaxing, feeling for the first time that maybe she could build a life here, that maybe Fort McDowell could become home. She did not see Henry for the next several days, though she thought about him constantly. She threw herself into work at the boarding house, learning Dorothy's routines and proving herself useful. She cleaned rooms and helped with laundry, peeled potatoes and kneaded bread dough, served meals and washed dishes. Dorothy was pleased with her work and told her so often, and the other boarders treated her with friendly respect. It was a good situation, but Katelyn could not shake the feeling that something was missing. Then, on her 5th day in Fort McDowell, Henry appeared at the boarding house just as she was sweeping the front porch. Her heart jumped when she saw him tying his horse to the rail, and she had to force herself to keep breathing normally. "Hello," he said, climbing the steps with that easy grace she remembered. "How are you settling in?" "Very well. Dorothy has been wonderful and everyone here has been kind." "Good, that is good." He seemed slightly nervous, which was endearing. "I wanted to check on you, make sure you were doing all right." "I am, thanks to you. I did not do that much. You saved my life, Henry." He looked away, uncomfortable again with her gratitude. "Well, I am glad you are safe. That is all that matters." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, and then Katelyn said on impulse, "Would you like to come in for coffee? Dorothy always has a pot on the stove." Henry's face brightened. "I would like that." She led him into the kitchen where Dorothy was rolling out pie dough. The older woman greeted Henry warmly and poured them both coffee, then shooed them out to the dining room so she could work in peace. They sat at the long table, and Katelyn found herself searching for things to say, suddenly shy. This felt different than their time at the line shack, more charged somehow, more significant. "Tell me about the double bar," she said finally. "How long have you worked there?" "About 4 years. I came to Arizona from Texas after my parents died. They had a small ranch, but we lost it to drought and debt. I was 19 and on my own, so I drifted for a while, taking work where I could find it. Eventually, I ended up here, and the double bar owner, a man named Jack Drummond, gave me a chance. I have been there ever since." "Do you like the work?" "I do. It is hard, especially during roundup and branding season, but I like being outside working with cattle and horses. And Jack is a fair boss. He pays on time and treats his men right. Do you ever want your own ranch again?" Henry smiled, but there was sadness in it. Every cowboy dreams of having his own spread, but land is expensive and I have not saved nearly enough. Maybe someday if I am lucky. "I think you will," Katelyn said. "You seem like someone who works hard for what he wants." "I try. What about you?" "What do you want?" It was a question no one had ever asked her before. Her father had made all the decisions about their future, and she had simply followed along. Now, for the first time, she had to think about what she wanted for herself. "I want to feel safe," she said slowly. "I want to have a home, a real home, not just a place I am staying temporarily. I want to belong somewhere." Henry nodded, his blue eyes understanding. "That makes sense after everything you have been through." "You feel like you belong here?" she asked. "More than I did in Texas. Fort McDowell is a good town and the people here have accepted me. But I still feel like I am waiting for something, like there is something missing. Does that make sense?" "It does. I feel the same way." Their eyes met across the table and held, and Katelyn felt that flutter again, stronger than ever. There was something happening between them, something real and undeniable, and she could see in Henry's expression that he felt it too. The air seemed to thicken, charged with possibility. Dorothy came bustling in with a pie fresh from the oven, breaking the moment. "Here we are, apple pie with cinnamon. Henry, you will stay and have a slice, will you not?" "I should probably get back to the ranch," Henry said, but he sounded reluctant. "Nonsense. Jack Drummond can spare you for another hour. Sit." Henry stayed, and they ate pie and talked about easier things, The weather, the town gossip, the new family that had just moved in down the street. When he finally left, he paused at the door and said to Katelyn, "Would you like to go for a ride sometime? I could show you the area, help you get to know the territory." "I would like that very much. Sunday afternoon. I am off work then. Sunday is perfect." He smiled at her, that transformative smile that made him look younger and happier, and then he was gone, riding away on his bay horse. Katelyn watched from the window until he disappeared around a corner, her heart beating faster than usual. She had agreed to go riding with him. It felt like a courtship or the beginning of one, and the thought both thrilled and terrified her. Sarah found her still standing at the window and laughed. "That was Henry Whitman, was it not? The cowboy who rescued you?" "Yes, he came to check on me and asked you to go riding." "I saw the whole thing from upstairs. How romantic." Katelyn felt herself blushing. "It is not romantic, he is just being kind, if you say so. But I have seen the way he looks at you, Katelyn. That man is smitten." "You are imagining things. We will see," Sarah said with a knowing smile. The days until Sunday dragged by slowly. Katelyn continued her work at the boarding house, but her mind was always half elsewhere, thinking about Henry and what their ride together would be like. She borrowed a split riding skirt from Sarah, who claimed she never used it anymore, and spent an embarrassing amount of time on Sunday morning trying to arrange her hair in a way that looked nice, but not like she was trying too hard. Henry arrived exactly when he said he would, leading 2 horses, his bay gelding and a gentle-looking gray mare. "Borrowed her from Jack," he explained as he helped Katelyn mount. "She has a smooth gait and a sweet temperament. You will like her." They rode out of town heading east, following a trail that wound through grassland dotted with mesquite and prickly pear cactus. The sky was a brilliant blue, the air warm but not hot, perfect weather for riding. Henry pointed out landmarks as they went, telling her about the different ranches in the area and the people who owned them. He was more talkative than she had seen him before, more relaxed, and she found herself relaxing too, enjoying the rhythm of the horse beneath her and the vastness of the landscape around them. After an hour or so, Henry led her to a spot where a creek ran through a grove of cottonwood trees, their leaves bright green and rustling in the breeze. "This is one of my favorite places," he said as they dismounted. "It is peaceful here, good for thinking." They let the horses drink from the creek and graze on the grass, and then they sat on a fallen log in the dappled shade. Katelyn could hear birds singing in the branches above them and the burble of water over rocks. It was peaceful, just as Henry had said, a pocket of calm in the wild territory. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said. "It is beautiful." "I wanted you to see that Arizona is not all blizzards and danger," Henry said with a slight smile. "There is beauty here too if you know where to look. I am starting to see that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Henry said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What are you most afraid of?" It was an unexpectedly deep question, and Katelyn had to think about her answer. "Being alone," she said finally. "Losing everyone I care about and ending up with no one. When my father died and the wagon train left me, I thought that was it, that I would die completely alone with no one to even remember I had existed. That terrified me more than the cold or the hunger or anything else." Henry nodded slowly. "That is my fear too. I have been alone since I was 19. I have friends, people who care about me, but it is not the same as having family. Sometimes I wake up in the bunkhouse and think about how if I died tomorrow, there would be no one to truly mourn me, just coworkers and acquaintances. That is a lonely thought." "I would mourn you," Katelyn said quietly. "If something happened to you, I would mourn you." He turned to look at her, his blue eyes intense. "You barely know me. I know you stopped to help someone in a storm when you could have kept riding. I know you stayed up all night to make sure I did not freeze. I know you brought me to safety and made sure I had a place to stay. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are, Henry Whitman." Something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability she had not seen before. "I am glad I found you," he said softly. "I know that sounds strange, but I cannot stop thinking about what would have happened if I had ridden a different trail that day, or left the line shack an hour earlier or later. You would have died, and I would never have known you existed. That thought makes me feel sick. But you did find me. That has to mean something. I think it does. I think maybe we were meant to find each other." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers rough and warm against hers. Katelyn's breath caught in her throat. This was really happening. He felt it too. This connection that had sparked to life between them in the middle of a blizzard and had been growing stronger every day since. "Katelyn," he said, and there was a question in his voice, in his eyes. "Yes," she whispered, not even sure what she was agreeing to, just knowing that she wanted this, wanted him. Henry leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she did not pull away. When his lips touched hers, it was gentle, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. Katelyn closed her eyes and kissed him back, feeling warmth spread through her entire body. It was her first real kiss, and it was perfect, sweet and tender and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the moment I saw you," he confessed. "Even when you were half frozen and barely conscious, I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." Katelyn laughed shakily. "I find that hard to believe. I must have looked terrible." "You looked like someone worth saving. Someone special." They kissed again, longer this time, and when they finally broke apart they were both smiling. The world felt different now, brighter and more hopeful, full of possibility. They stayed by the creek for another hour, talking and kissing and making plans. Henry wanted to court her properly, he said, to do this right. He would take her on outings when he could get away from the ranch, and she would get to know him and decide if he was someone she could build a future with. Katelyn agreed, though part of her felt like she had already made that decision. She was falling in love with him, had been falling since the moment he lifted her onto his horse and promised she was safe. Over the following weeks, Henry came to see her whenever he could, which was usually twice a week on his days off from the ranch. They went riding, attended church socials together, and spent long evenings sitting on the boarding house porch talking about everything and nothing. The other boarders teased them good-naturedly about their courtship, and Dorothy watched them with maternal approval. Sarah became a trusted confidante, listening to Katelyn's breathless accounts of each date and offering advice on matters of the heart. Henry was a wonderful suitor, attentive and respectful and clearly besotted. He brought her wildflowers and pretty rocks he found on the range. He taught her to rope a fence post and how to read the weather in the clouds. He told her stories about his childhood in Texas, about learning to ride before he could properly walk and helping his father with cattle when he was barely tall enough to see over the fence rails. He talked about his parents with love and sadness, about how hard they had worked to keep their ranch going and how devastated his father had been when they lost it. "He died of a broken heart," Henry said. "The doctor said it was his heart that gave out, but I know it was losing the ranch that killed him. And my mother just gave up after that. She died 6 months later." "I am so sorry," Katelyn said, squeezing his hand. "That must have been terrible for you." "It was. But I am learning that loss is part of life. The important thing is to keep going, to find new things to live for and new people to care about." "Like me?" she asked softly. "Like you," he confirmed, kissing her forehead. Katelyn told him about her own childhood, about growing up in Missouri with parents who loved her but struggled to make ends meet. Her father had been a carpenter, but work had been inconsistent, and there had been lean years when they barely had enough to eat. Her mother had been the steady force in the family, always optimistic, always finding ways to make their small house feel like a home. When she died, everything had fallen apart. Her father had lost his will to work, had spent too much time at the saloon drinking away his grief. The move to California had been an attempt to escape the memories, to start fresh somewhere her mother's absence was not felt in every corner. "You think they would have liked each other?" Henry asked. "Your parents and mine, if they had all lived and met somehow, I think they would have. They all understood hard work and family and trying to make something of themselves despite the odds." "That is what we are doing now," Henry said. "Making something of ourselves, together." The word together made Katelyn's heart swell. She loved how Henry thought of them as a unit, how he talked about the future as something they would share. He had started saving money more aggressively, he told her, setting aside every penny he could spare. His dream of owning a ranch was not just a dream anymore, but a goal, something he was working toward with renewed determination, because now he had someone to build that future with. One Sunday in early spring, about 3 months after they met, Henry took her to see the Double Bar Ranch. It was a sprawling operation with several thousand head of cattle and dozens of horses, all managed by a crew of about 20 cowboys. Jack Drummond, the owner, was a big man with a booming laugh and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He greeted Katelyn warmly and told Henry he had done well for himself. "About time you found yourself a good woman," Jack said, clapping Henry on the shoulder. "I was beginning to think you were married to the cattle." Thomas was there too, and he gave Katelyn a grandfatherly hug and told her she looked much better than the last time he had seen her. They ate lunch in the ranch house with Jack's wife Martha, a practical woman who ran the household with military efficiency. After lunch, Henry showed Katelyn around the property, pointing out the corrals and barns, the bunkhouse where he lived, the wide open pastures where the cattle grazed. It was impressive, and Katelyn could see why Henry loved working here. There was a rhythm to ranch life, a connection to the land and animals that felt elemental and real. "You think you could be happy living on a ranch?" Henry asked as they stood at a fence watching the horses. "It is a hard life. Early mornings, long days, isolation sometimes." "I could be happy anywhere if you were there," Katelyn said honestly. "But yes, I think I could love ranch life. I like the idea of being part of something, of working together to build and maintain something meaningful." Henry smiled and pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I am going to marry you, Katelyn Blake. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not this year, but someday soon I am going to ask you to be my wife and spend the rest of your life with me." "I will say yes," she whispered against his chest. "Whenever you ask, the answer will be yes." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the horses and planning their future. Katelyn felt at peace in a way she had not since before her mother died. She had found what she was looking for: a home, a purpose, and someone who loved her completely. The fear and loneliness that had defined the past few years were fading, replaced by hope and joy, and the certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Summer came to Fort McDowell in waves of heat that made the air shimmer and turned the streets to dust. Henry continued working at the Double Bar, helping with the summer roundup and breaking new horses for the remuda. He came to see Katelyn whenever he could, though sometimes a week or more would pass between visits due to the demands of ranch work. Those weeks were hard for Katelyn, who missed him with an intensity that surprised her. She had never been one of those girls who pined for a man, but Henry had become essential to her happiness, and his absence left a hole in her days. She kept busy at the boarding house, which was fuller now that summer travel had increased. Dorothy hired another girl to help with the extra work, a shy 17-year-old named Emma, whose family had fallen on hard times. Katelyn took Emma under her wing, teaching her the routines and helping her gain confidence. It felt good to help someone else, to pay forward the kindness that had been shown to her. In July, Henry arrived at the boarding house with news. "Jack is sending me to Prescott to buy some breeding bulls," he said, his excitement barely contained. "He is trusting me to make the deal on my own. This is a big responsibility, Katelyn. If I do this well, it could mean a promotion, maybe even a foreman position eventually." "That is wonderful," Katelyn exclaimed. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow. I will be gone about 10 days. I wish you could come with me, but it is a hard ride and I will be sleeping rough most of the time." "I understand. I will miss you, but I am so proud of you for this opportunity." Henry pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "When I get back, I want to talk to you about something important, something I have been thinking about for a while now." Katelyn's heart skipped. "What is it?" "It can wait until I return. I want to do this properly." "Just know that I love you, Katelyn, more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." "I love you too," she said, and it was the first time either of them had said the words out loud. They hung in the air between them, precious and powerful, changing everything. Henry kissed her deeply, and when he finally pulled away, they were both breathless. "10 days," he said, "and then we will talk about our future." He left the next morning before dawn, and Katelyn stood at her window watching the sun rise over the town, feeling both excited and nervous. She knew what he was going to ask when he returned. He was going to propose, and she was going to say yes, and their life together would truly begin. The thought filled her with joy and a touch of fear. Marriage was a big step, a commitment that would bind them together for life. But she was ready for it. Henry was the person she wanted to build a life with, the person she wanted to wake up next to every morning for the rest of her days. The 10 days passed slowly. Katelyn worked and waited, and tried not to let her anxiety show. Sarah noticed anyway and teased her gently about being lovesick. Dorothy seemed to know something was brewing and treated Katelyn with extra kindness. Even the other boarders seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen, though they did not pry. On the 9th day, Thomas arrived at the boarding house in the late afternoon, his face grim. Katelyn was sweeping the porch when he rode up, and she knew immediately that something was wrong. Her stomach dropped and her hands went cold. "Is it Henry?" she asked, her voice barely working. "There was an accident," Thomas said heavily. "A stagecoach got held up on the road to Prescott. Henry tried to help and he got shot. They are bringing him back now, but it is bad, Katelyn. Real bad." The broom fell from her hands. "How bad?" "I do not know all the details." "Jack got a telegram this morning and sent me to tell you. They should be here by nightfall." Katelyn did not remember going back inside or packing a bag or telling Dorothy what had happened. The next thing she knew, she was on a horse with Thomas, riding toward the edge of town where the Prescott Road came in. They waited as the sun set, watching the horizon, and finally she saw a wagon approaching slowly, flanked by 2 riders. It was Jack Drummond driving the wagon, and as they got closer, Katelyn could see Henry lying in the back, pale and still. She jumped off her horse before it had fully stopped and ran to the wagon, climbing up beside Henry. There was blood, so much blood, soaking through bandages wrapped around his side and shoulder. His eyes were closed and his breathing was shallow. "Henry," she said, taking his hand. "Can you hear me? It is Katelyn. I am here." His eyes fluttered open and focused on her with difficulty. "Katelyn," he whispered, "you came." "Of course I came. Where are you hurt?" "Bullet in the shoulder, grazed my ribs. I am fine." "You are not fine. You are bleeding everywhere." "Looks worse than it is," he said, trying to smile and failing. "Did not want to scare you." "Too late for that," she said, tears streaming down her face. Jack drove them to the town's doctor, a competent man named Dr. Pierce, who examined Henry and announced that while the injuries were serious, they were not life-threatening. The shoulder wound had missed major blood vessels and the bullet had passed clean through. The rib injury was shallow. With proper care and rest, Henry would recover fully. Katelyn stayed by his side as doctor. Pierce cleaned and stitched the wounds, holding Henry's hand as he gritted his teeth against the pain. When it was finally over, and Henry was bandaged and dosed with laudanum for the pain, Dr. Pierce said he could go home as long as someone stayed with him to watch for fever or infection. "He can stay at the boarding house," Katelyn said immediately. "I will take care of him." Dr. Pierce hesitated. "That might not be proper, you being unmarried and all." "I do not care about proper," Katelyn said fiercely. "He saved my life. Now I am going to save his." Jack Drummond spoke up. "Let the girl do what she needs to do, Doc. These two are as good as married anyway, just have not had the ceremony yet." So Henry was moved to the boarding house and installed in a room on the first floor near the kitchen. Katelyn barely left his side for the next 3 days, bringing him food and water, changing his bandages, helping him to the outhouse when he was strong enough to walk. Dorothy helped when she could, and Sarah sat with Henry when Katelyn needed to sleep. The other boarders checked in regularly, bringing small gifts and words of encouragement. Henry was a terrible patient, restless and frustrated by his weakness. "I should be at work," he grumbled on the 3rd day. "Jack needs help with the roundup." "Jack needs you to heal properly so you can work for years to come," Katelyn said firmly. "Now eat your soup and stop complaining." He obeyed, but he was not happy about it. That evening, when the laudanum had worn off and he was more lucid, he caught her hand and pulled her to sit on the edge of the bed. "I need to tell you what happened," he said. "You do not have to, not if it is hard to talk about. I want you to know." The stagecoach was stopped about 5 miles outside Prescott. 3 men with guns demanding money and valuables. I was riding past and I heard the women screaming. I could not just ride away. "Of course you could not," Katelyn said, because that was who Henry was. "I tried to scare them off by firing shots in the air, but one of them turned and shot me. I went down and they ran. The stage driver got me to Prescott and the sheriff sent a posse after the bandits. I do not know if they caught them." "You could have been killed," Katelyn said, her voice shaking. "I know. And all I could think as I was lying there bleeding was that I never got to ask you the question I have been planning to ask. Henry, no, let me say this while I have the courage. I know I am lying in a borrowed bed with holes in me, and I cannot even get on one knee properly, but I cannot wait anymore. Katelyn Blake, I love you more than anything in this world. You are the reason I wake up in the morning and the last thing I think about before I sleep. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife and let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy?" Katelyn was crying again, but these were happy tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you. I love you, Henry, so much." He pulled her down and kissed her, and she tasted salt from her tears and felt his heart beating strong and steady beneath her palm. This was not how she had imagined this moment, but it was perfect anyway because they were together and alive and in love, and nothing else mattered. They were married 3 weeks later in the little white church in Fort McDowell, as soon as Henry was healed enough to stand without wincing. Jack Drummond gave Katelyn away, and Thomas stood up as Henry's best man. Dorothy and Sarah cried through the entire ceremony, and most of the town turned out to witness the union. Katelyn wore a dress that Dorothy and Sarah had sewn for her, simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, and Henry wore his best shirt and a new vest that he had bought specially for the occasion. They said their vows in front of God and everyone they cared about, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. The wedding breakfast was held at the boarding house, with tables set up in the yard and more food than seemed possible. People brought gifts, quilts and dishes and tools, practical things they would need to start their life together. Jack gave them a breeding pair of chickens and a promise of help when they were ready to buy land. Thomas presented them with a beautiful handmade cradle and said with a wink that they would be needing it soon enough. As the sun set and the guests began to drift away, Henry took Katelyn's hand and led her to the small house that Jack had offered them rent-free until they could afford their own place. It was tiny, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was theirs. Henry carried her over the threshold as tradition demanded, and when he set her down in the middle of their new home, they were both grinning like children. "Mrs. Whitman," Henry said, testing out the name. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Katelyn said, sliding her arms around his neck. "So do I." That night they became husband and wife in every sense, learning each other slowly and tenderly, with whispered words of love and wonder. Katelyn had been nervous, uncertain what to expect, but Henry was gentle and patient, making sure she felt safe and cherished. Afterward they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, talking quietly about their dreams and plans, about the ranch they would build someday and the children they hoped to have. "How many children do you want?" Henry asked, his hand tracing lazy patterns on her back. "I do not know. 3, 4. "How many do you want?" "As many as you will give me. I want a big family, Katelyn. I want a house full of noise and laughter, the opposite of how alone I have been." "Then that is what we will have," she promised. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the following months. Henry returned to work at the double bar, and Katelyn kept house and took in sewing to earn extra money. They saved every penny they could, watching their small fund grow slowly but steadily. Henry was promoted to assistant foreman, which came with a raise in pay and more responsibility. He thrived in the role, proving himself capable and trustworthy, and Jack began talking about Henry possibly buying into the ranch someday as a junior partner. In the spring, Katelyn discovered she was pregnant. She told Henry one evening after supper, watching his face carefully to gauge his reaction. For a moment he just stared at her, processing the news, and then he let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around the kitchen until she laughed and begged him to stop. "We are having a baby," he said, setting her down and cupping her face in his hands. "Katelyn, we are really having a baby. We really are. Are you happy?" "Happy does not begin to cover it. I am over the moon. I am the luckiest man alive." He kissed her deeply, and then he knelt and kissed her still flat belly, talking to the baby that was no bigger than a bean. Katelyn ran her fingers through his dark hair and felt her heart overflow with love. This was everything she had wanted, everything she had hoped for during those dark days after her father's death. She had a home, a husband who adored her, and a baby on the way. She had survived the wilderness and built a life on the other side of loss, and it was better than anything she could have imagined. The pregnancy was easy at first, though Katelyn tired more quickly than usual and found herself needing afternoon naps. Henry was attentive to the point of being overbearing, constantly worrying about her health and whether she was overdoing it. Dorothy scolded him for hovering and told Katelyn that this was normal behavior for first-time fathers. Sarah gave her a book about pregnancy and childbirth that she found both informative and terrifying. As summer turned to fall and Katelyn's belly grew round and prominent, she began to feel the baby move, flutters at first and then stronger kicks that made her gasp. Henry would put his hand on her stomach and wait patiently for the baby to kick, and his face would light up every time he felt movement. They spent long evenings discussing names, debating the merits of family names versus something entirely new. They prepared the cradle Thomas had given them, lining it with soft blankets and positioning it beside their bed. The baby came on a cold December night, 3 weeks before Christmas. Katelyn woke to cramping pains and knew immediately what was happening. Henry ran for the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Larson, who had delivered half the babies in Fort McDowell. Dorothy and Sarah arrived soon after to help, and Henry was banished to the kitchen where he paced and worried and drove Thomas, who had come to keep him company, nearly crazy with his agitation. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the next day. Katelyn had never experienced such pain, but Mrs. Larson coached her through it, telling her when to push and when to breathe. Dorothy held her hand, and Sarah wiped her forehead with cool cloths. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, the baby emerged with a lusty cry that seemed impossibly loud from such a tiny body. "It is a boy," Mrs. Larson announced, holding up the squirming infant. "A big, healthy boy." Katelyn burst into exhausted tears as they placed the baby on her chest, still connected by the cord. He was red and wrinkled and covered in vernix, and he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He had a shock of dark hair like his father, and he was screaming his outrage at being born, tiny fists waving in the air. "Hello, sweet boy," Katelyn whispered. "Welcome to the world." They let Henry in a few minutes later, after the baby had been cleaned and swaddled and Katelyn had been made presentable. He came in slowly, almost timidly, his eyes huge and scared and awed all at once. When he saw the baby in Katelyn's arms, he stopped breathing for a moment. "Come meet your son," Katelyn said softly. Henry approached the bed like he was walking on holy ground. He sat carefully on the edge and looked down at the baby, and Katelyn saw tears spilling down his cheeks. "He is so small," Henry said in wonder. "So perfect. Do you want to hold him?" "Can I?" Katelyn showed him how to support the head and shoulders, and then she transferred the precious bundle into Henry's arms. He held his son like he was made of spun glass, staring down at the tiny face with an expression of absolute devotion. The baby had stopped crying and was looking up at his father with unfocused eyes, and Katelyn watched them fall in love with each other in that instant. "What should we name him?" Henry asked, his voice thick with emotion. They had debated this endlessly, but now, looking at her husband holding their son, Katelyn knew exactly what his name should be. "James, after your father, James Henry Whitman." Henry looked up at her, his eyes shining. "Are you sure?" "I am sure." "Your father would be so proud of the man you have become, Henry. This is a way to honor him." "Thank you," Henry whispered. "James it is." "Hello, James. I am your father, and I promise I will always protect you and love you and do my best to be someone you can be proud of." The baby made a small sound, and they both laughed through their tears. Mrs. Larson shooed Henry out soon after so Katelyn could rest, but he came back every hour to check on them, unable to stay away for long. That night, with baby James sleeping peacefully in the cradle beside their bed, Henry and Katelyn lay together in the darkness, talking about the future. "I am going to work harder than I ever have," Henry said. "I am going to save every penny so we can buy land and build our ranch. I want James to grow up with his own land, his own legacy. I do not want him to ever feel lost or rootless like we did." "We will build it together," Katelyn said. "The three of us. A family." "A family," Henry repeated, and the word was full of promise and hope. James was a good baby, healthy and mostly content. He looked more like Henry every day, with his dark hair and blue eyes and serious expression. Katelyn fell into the rhythms of motherhood, learning to feed and change and soothe. navigating the exhaustion and the overwhelming love that came with caring for an infant. Henry was a devoted father, helping whenever he was home, talking to James constantly and carrying him around the house while he did chores. The baby clearly recognized his father's voice and would calm immediately when Henry held him. Spring came again, and with it new possibilities. Jack Drummond approached Henry with a proposition. There was land available about 15 miles from Fort McDowell, good grazing land with water access. If Henry could come up with 20% of the purchase price, Jack would loan him the rest at low interest, to be paid back over 10 years. It was the opportunity they had been working toward, and Henry came home that night barely able to contain his excitement. "Do we have enough saved?" Katelyn asked, already doing math in her head. "Almost. We are about $100 short, but Jack said we have 6 months to raise the money. I think we can do it if we are careful." They both took on extra work. Henry hired himself out for odd jobs on his days off, and Katelyn increased her sewing work, staying up late after James was asleep to finish orders. They ate simple meals and spent nothing on luxuries. Dorothy, learning of their goal, quietly reduced their rent. Thomas organized a barn raising fund among the double bar crew, and each man contributed what he could. Sarah held a bake sale at the school and gave them the proceeds. It took 5 months, but they reached their goal. Henry counted the money 3 times to be sure, then stood and pulled Katelyn into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around just like he had when she told him she was pregnant. "We did it," he said. "We are going to be landowners. We are going to have our own ranch." They named it the Whispering Pines Ranch after the stand of pine trees that bordered the creek running through the property. The land was beautiful, 200 acres of rolling grassland with good water and plenty of natural shelter. The house was small and needed work, but it was solid and well built, with 3 rooms and a large fireplace. There was a barn that needed a new roof and some corrals that needed mending, but nothing they could not handle together. They moved in on a bright June day with the help of Jack, Thomas, Dorothy, Sarah, and half the town. Everyone contributed something: furniture, tools, livestock, seeds for a garden. By nightfall they had a functioning household, and that night they sat on the porch of their own home, on their own land, and watched the stars come out. James was asleep inside, and the sounds of crickets and night birds filled the air. "You remember when I found you in the snow?" Henry asked, taking her hand. "I remember everything about that day. I thought I was going to die. I told you then that I would not let you wander again, that you were safe. You did, and you kept that promise." Henry turned to face her, his blue eyes serious in the starlight. "I am making you a new promise now. I promise that as long as I draw breath, you and James will have a home. You will have security and love and everything I can give you. You will never be lost again." Katelyn felt tears prick her eyes. "You already gave me all of that, Henry. You gave me everything the moment you stopped to help a stranger in a blizzard. You are not a stranger. You are my wife, the love of my life, my everything." They kissed under the stars, and Katelyn felt the rightness of it all, the way everything had come together against all odds. She had lost everything and been found. She had been alone and was now loved. She had wandered in the wilderness and had found home. The years that followed were full and good. They built the ranch slowly, adding cattle a few at a time, improving the buildings, expanding the pastures. Henry proved to be an excellent rancher, patient with the animals and smart about managing resources. Katelyn ran the household and helped with the ranch work when she could, becoming an accomplished rider and a fair hand with a rope. They worked together in everything, partners in the truest sense. James grew into a bright, curious boy who loved horses and following his father around the ranch. When he was 3, Katelyn gave birth to twin girls they named Sarah Rose and Margaret Dorothy, after the women who had helped them so much. The twins were identical with golden curls and green eyes, nothing like their dark-haired parents or brother, and they were absolute terrors who kept everyone constantly on their toes. 2 years after the twins came another boy, whom they named Thomas Jack after the 2 men who had been like fathers to Henry. Then came another daughter, Grace Elizabeth, and finally, when Katelyn was 33 and thought she was done having babies, a surprise son they named Daniel. The house that had seemed spacious with just the 2 of them was chaos with 6 children, but it was the kind of chaos that came with love and life and growing things. There was always noise, always laughter, always someone needing something. Henry thrived on it, coming in from the range to be mobbed by his children, reading stories by the fire at night, teaching the older ones to ride and rope and care for animals. Katelyn watched him with their children and fell in love with him all over again every day. The ranch prospered. They paid off the loan to Jack 3 years early and bought additional land. They hired hands to help with the work, and Henry gained a reputation as a fair boss who paid well and treated his workers with respect. The Whispering Pines cattle were known for their quality, and buyers came from as far as California to purchase breeding stock. Through it all, Henry and Katelyn remained each other's anchor and best friend. They still sat on the porch together after the children were asleep, holding hands and talking about their days. They still stole kisses in the barn and made love with the passion of newlyweds despite the passage of years. They weathered droughts and hard winters, sickness and loss, and came through it all stronger and more committed. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Henry surprised Katelyn with a party. He had invited everyone they cared about, had arranged for the children to stay with Dorothy for the night, and had spent weeks planning every detail. The house was decorated with wildflowers, and he had hired musicians from town. They danced under the stars like they had at their wedding, older now but no less in love. 20 years, Henry said as they swayed to the music. Best 20 years of my life. Mine too, Katelyn said, resting her head on his shoulder. Do you ever think about that day in the snow? How different things could have been, all the time. If I had left the line shack an hour earlier, if I had taken a different trail, if the storm had been worse. 100 different things could have changed everything. But they did not. You found me. You saved me. No, Henry said, pulling back to look at her. You saved me. I was going through the motions of living, working, and existing, but not really alive. You gave me purpose and love and a reason to dream. You made me whole. We saved each other then, Katelyn said. 2 lost souls who found each other in a blizzard and built a life together. They kissed, and Katelyn felt the same flutter in her chest that she had felt all those years ago when Henry first took her hand. Some things never changed. Some loves burned steady and true no matter how much time passed. The children grew up strong and capable. James took to ranching like he was born to it and became Henry's right hand as soon as he was old enough to be useful. The twins were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and getting into mischief together. Thomas Jack was quiet and thoughtful, preferring books to horses, but learning the ranch work anyway because his father needed him. Grace was the wild one, fearless and adventurous, always climbing things she should not climb and riding horses that were too spirited for her. Daniel, the baby, was sweet and sensitive, the peacemaker among his siblings. As the children grew older and started families of their own, the ranch expanded to accommodate them. James built a house on the western section and brought home a bride, a rancher's daughter named Catherine who fit into the family seamlessly. The twins both married within a year of each other, Sarah rose to a banker from town and Margaret Dorothy to a horse trainer they met at a fair in Prescott. They did not move far, staying close to family, and soon the ranch was full of grandchildren. Henry and Katelyn grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down, but their love remaining constant. They sat on the porch every evening, watching the sun set over the land they had built together, surrounded by children and grandchildren and the life they had created. Henry still held her hand like he had on that first ride from the line shack to Fort McDowell, still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. One spring evening, when Katelyn was 68 and Henry was 71, they sat together watching a storm roll in from the mountains. It was not a blizzard like the one that had brought them together all those years ago, just a gentle spring rain that would be good for the grass. But it made Katelyn think about that day, about being lost and found, about the moment her life changed forever. "You have any regrets?" she asked Henry, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Not a single one," he said firmly. "Every choice I made led me to you. Every hard thing I went through was worth it because it brought us here. This life, this family, you beside me, it is more than I ever dreamed possible." I feel the same way. Sometimes I think about that girl in the snow, how frightened and alone she was. I wish I could go back and tell her that everything was going to be all right, that she was going to be found by a cowboy with blue eyes who would love her for the rest of her life. "You were worth finding," Henry said. "You were worth everything." They sat in comfortable silence as the rain began to fall, soft and steady, nourishing the land. Around them, the ranch they had built together hummed with life. Cattle lowing in the distance, horses nickering in the barn, grandchildren laughing in the house behind them. It was a legacy, a testament to what two people could build when they refused to give up, when they chose love over fear, when they found each other against all odds. The rain fell gentle on the roof of the house, and Henry pulled Katelyn closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. She fit against him perfectly, the way she always had. Two pieces of a whole that had been searching for each other through blizzards and wilderness until finally, mercifully, they met. "I love you," Henry said, the words as fresh and true as the first time he had spoken them. "I love you too," Katelyn replied, knowing that this love was the greatest adventure of her life, better than any dream, stronger than any storm. They had been lost, both of them, wandering in their own ways through grief and loneliness. But they had found each other, and in finding each other, they had found home. The snow had covered the trail, but the cowboy had found her anyway, and he had kept his promise. He had never let her wander again. They had walked through life together, hand in hand, building something beautiful and true. And as the rain fell soft around them and the evening drew close, they sat together in the home they had made, surrounded by the love they had nurtured, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together, just as they always had. Their story was one of survival and second chances, of love found in the most unlikely of places. It was a story told around dinner tables and campfires, passed down through generations of Whitmans who came after them. The story of how grandmother Katelyn had been lost in a blizzard, and how grandfather Henry had found her and promised she would never wander alone again. How two broken people had put each other back together and built an empire of love and family in the Arizona Territory. Years later, when both Henry and Katelyn had passed peacefully in their sleep within days of each other, as if neither could bear to be without the other even in death, their children gathered to remember them. They stood in the cemetery on a hill overlooking the Whispering Pines Ranch, looking at the twin headstones that read Henry Whitman, beloved husband and father, and Katelyn Whitman, beloved wife and mother. Beneath both names, they had inscribed the same words: Two souls who found each other in the storm. James, now an old man himself, turned to his own children and grandchildren and told them the story one more time. How their grandmother had been abandoned by a wagon train and left to die in a blizzard. How their grandfather had been riding through that storm and had heard a voice in the wind, a call he could not ignore. How he had found her in the snow and lifted her onto his horse and promised her safety. How that promise had turned into a love story that lasted 53 years and produced 6 children, 23 grandchildren, and countless great-grandchildren, who all owed their existence to a cowboy who stopped to help a stranger in need. They taught us what love really means, James said, his voice breaking with emotion. It is not just poetry and flowers, though Father gave Mother plenty of both. It is choosing someone every single day. It is working together through hard times. It is building something that lasts beyond your own life. They gave us the gift of their love, and we honor them by loving as fiercely as they did. The family stood together on that hill, multiple generations united by the legacy of two people who had refused to give up on each other or themselves. The wind blew soft across the grassland, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, and for a moment it seemed like Henry and Katelyn were there with them, young again, riding across their land with the sun on their faces and the future bright before them. The Whispering Pines Ranch continued to thrive, passed down through the generations, but always carrying the spirit of its founders. The house where Henry and Katelyn had raised their children was preserved, kept as a reminder of where they had started and what they had built. Young couples from the family would sometimes spend their wedding night there, sleeping in the same room where Henry and Katelyn had slept, hoping that some of that enduring love would bless their own marriages. The story of the blizzard was never forgotten. It became the founding myth of the family, the beginning of everything good in their lives. Children would ask to hear it again and again, and each time the story was told, it reinforced the values that Henry and Katelyn had lived by. Kindness to strangers, courage in the face of fear, the power of love to transform and redeem. In the town of Fort McDowell, which had grown from a small settlement to a thriving city, there was a park named after Henry and Katelyn Whitman. It stood on the site of the old boarding house where they had first lived together, where Henry had proposed from a sick, and where they had brought baby James home for the first time. A bronze statue showed them as they had been in their youth, Henry helping Katelyn onto a horse, his hand steady and sure, her face turned toward his with trust and hope. At the base of the statue, an inscription read, "In memory of Henry and Katelyn Whitman, who proved that love can be found even in the coldest storms, and that two hearts once joined can create a legacy that lasts forever." Their story lived on, a testament to the power of compassion and connection, a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a simple choice to help someone in need. The snow had covered the trail, erasing the path and leaving Katelyn lost and alone. But the cowboy had found her anyway, guided by instinct or fate or divine providence, and when he lifted her onto his horse and wrapped his arm around her waist, he changed both their lives forever. He had promised she would never wander again, and he had kept that promise through 53 years of marriage, 6 children, dozens of grandchildren, and a love that grew stronger with each passing day. In the end, that was the true magic of their story. Not that they had survived a blizzard or built a successful ranch or raised a large family, though all those things were impressive. The real miracle was that they had found each other when they needed it most, two lost souls who recognized something essential in each other and chose to hold on. They had turned tragedy into triumph, loneliness into belonging, fear into faith. They had proved that even in the wildest, harshest places, love could take root and flourish. The seasons continued to turn at the Whispering Pines Ranch, snow giving way to spring, spring to summer, summer to fall, and then winter again. The land that Henry and Katelyn had claimed and nurtured continued to provide for their descendants. The love they had shared continued to inspire new generations to believe in the power of commitment and partnership. And somewhere, in the whisper of wind through pine trees or the gentle fall of snow on a winter's night, the echo of Henry's voice could still be heard, speaking the words that had started it all. "I have got you now. You are safe. I will never let you wander again." And Katelyn's response, soft but certain, "I trust you, I believe you, I choose you." Those words, spoken in desperation and hope during a blizzard in 1878, became the foundation of a love story that lasted a lifetime and beyond, proving that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the hardest trials, and that true love, once found, never truly dies. It simply transforms, becoming part of the land and the family and the stories we tell to remind ourselves that miracles do happen, that cowboys do rescue lost girls in snowstorms, and that promises made with a true heart are promises that endure forever.